my job is going to be very light with this group. So this panel discussion is for those who have been to the castle where slaves were loaded onto ships for the Middle Passage, and to share about their experiences, reflections, and what it means for us in the Episcopal Church here in our United States of America.
Me? You've actually had enough for me. Let me pass it. I'll pass it on. Well, I mean, I've already kind of shared a little bit about that. Part of what was a particular blessing was to go to both the slave camps and the castle as part of a pilgrimage with other pilgrims. There was something about Bishop Andrew and I were on the same together, and we got to spend some time together. And there's a lot of time on the bus, and there's just a lot of time together. And to be able to hear some of his story, and ours, that's holy stuff. And that made what could be a tourist thing a pilgrimage. And that, as much as anything, really affected me.
Who was on the trip with you?
Senior staff of
We have Mike.
It was senior staff of Episcopal Relief and Development, a number of bishops, and many members of your staff. It's probably the best way to put it, because there were about 25 of us on the trip.
And who on the panel here? And would you introduce yourself as you...
Andrew Waldo, Bishop of the Diocese of Upper South Carolina.
Does this one work?
Oh, it does. Oh.
So let's put this down.
Working too now? Yeah. All right, we're on.
That's much easier. I'm Lisa Barrowclough. I'm the chaplain and chair of religious life at Episcopal Day School in Augusta, Georgia. And I was part of the next pilgrimage to Ghana in the July following the bishop's January pilgrimage. It was a joint pilgrimage between Episcopal Relief and Development, which I agree is part of the glue, and the other glue in the Episcopal Church, the National Association of Episcopal Schools.
Of course. Yes.
And so there was a group of, there were 9 of us, 10 of us.
Something like that.
9 or 10 of us also agree with those sentiments about the pilgrimage, to experience that together. I'll let everyone else introduce themselves before I share any other.
I'm Heidi Kim. Can you hear me? Okay. This is my boss. Not intimidating at all to be sitting next to him. I am the staff officer for racial reconciliation for the Episcopal Church. And so when I first came on board in 2014, President Rob Radke of Episcopal Relief and Development had said, "You really need to come to Ghana with us." And my schedule never really allowed it. But since part of my portfolio was also working with Episcopal schools, this was a wonderful opportunity. When we took a pilgrimage to Ferguson, Missouri in the fall of 2015, and Father Steve Lawler is actually here right now, Bishop Wayne Smith said, a tourist comes into a place sort of looking at things and kind of experiencing them on a superficial level, but when a pilgrim comes, she immerses herself in the place and in its people and the relationships that we form there, that's what pilgrimage is about. And so I think that was the really important piece of seeing Ghana and those places as a pilgrim rather than just sort of a tourist.
Bishop Waldo, as we were talking about this conversation, you shared an amazing story of how your personal heritage of your family connects with what you saw in Africa.
Yeah, I'll go into that some more in my talk a little later, but suffice it to say that I have a family that has been involved, I want to be careful about the tense that I use in my verb here, that many years ago was very involved in slavery, and I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama in the early 60s. And so as soon as I heard about this trip, I said, I need, for the sake of my soul, to go on this trip. So.
And what have you brought back from your time, how is it affecting what you do in ministry right now?
I appreciated what the presiding bishop said with the poem from Maya Angelou, which I now need to print and hang up next to a quote that hangs in my office from C.S. Lewis about how we can't change the beginning of a story, but we can start where we are and change how it ends. And that really drives, for me, the kind of work, ministry that I do in Episcopal schools, working with a generation who need to hear these stories and need to know the truth about the history in order to not repeat it, in order to change it. I really believe every day that I'm blessed to encounter children who are going to change this world if they know why it needs changing. And so I came back from Ghana convinced that a story I didn't know much about, at least that piece of it, and that I was fortunate enough to learn by being among the people, that story needs to be told so that we don't repeat it. And I feel like the Ghanaians have done a great job of telling that. I was very, very moved and very struck by the way they tell their story. And I think I brought back some tools for telling that story as well, I hope.
Good. How have you described that to the kids in the school where you serve?
Well, we've only just begun. And more of it right now is with faculty and looking at even our own curriculum, to be honest about the way we tell this story, almost as if it began on these shores, that we sort of tell the story as the boat comes in to America. And we haven't told the stories of people's homes. We haven't told the stories of the so many lost who never got here, or the identity that people had before it was stripped away. And so that story has a lot of power to young people who are trying to figure out their own identity. It's pretty scandalous to a 12-year-old to hear that somebody's identity can be stripped from them, because they're just figuring out who they are. And to think that anyone could take that away doesn't go over very well with a middle schooler. And so to be able to really pull at their hearts and their experience with the pain of this, to understand that if they choose to not respect the dignity of every human being, that's the impact that it's having. And that in the same way that we stood in those churches over those dungeons and wonder how that disconnect, I wonder that sometimes too, in our beautiful church on this beautiful hill in this beautifully entitled part of town. I think, what am I standing on top of? So I'm still learning too. It impacts me, I think, every day. So to learn that it's a failure of formation today has given some words to something that's been nagging at me all these months. So I have to overthink that now.
Great. That's a good way to do it.
I was just going to say that one of the conversations that presiding bishop and I had while there was, he made the comment that as he listened at some point to me rehearsing some of my story, my family story, and he says, well, our task is not to wallow in the past, but to redeem it. And that really rings so profoundly true with everything you've said today, and certainly as we look ahead to the work that we have to do. The thing that, growing up among a culture of storytellers where the details of the story matter so much, and half the time it's spinning out the details that really draws a person into the story, to be in Ghana and to experience the details in a way so that the story itself takes on an entirely different kind of particularity and specificity that I found especially important for me as I began to reflect on what do I do with this experience. So.
For my experience was a little bit different. Going to Ghana as a Korean American immigrant to the United States, whose parents were internally displaced refugees during the war in Korea, and my father had his own door of no return because his father was very anti-communist, and they lived in the northern part of Korea, and so he fled to the south, put himself through college, became a dentist. But I have no connection with that side of my family. I have no idea what happened to my father's side of the family. So it's almost as though when we landed in the US, we kind of started all over again, and our history started with my parents. So going to Ghana then was, I didn't sort of have this US kind of based, similar kind of, oh, what am I going to feel when I'm there? I just really wanted to learn. And of course, when we landed in Accra, which is this incredibly developed place, I see my people, right? I see Samsung, I see Hyundai, I see Kia, right? And like the Koreans are in Ghana. And I started hearing about these families where Korean business people had come into Ghana and set up business there, married Ghanaian women, had children, and then at some point just left and went back to Korea. Now, this is the criticism that Koreans make of the Japanese during the Japanese colonial period, that the Japanese came in, they enslaved our girls, 10-year-old girls were being taken away as sexual slaves, and all of this oppression. And I was thinking, as I'm walking around, I'm seeing all these Korean goods, I'm seeing this sort of Korean affluence, and as we go to the north of Ghana, I see an area that is kind of beginning to develop economically with a lot of cheap imported goods. And I'm saying, wow, this looks like rural Korea 25 years ago. And I wonder where Ghana is going to be 25 years from now. And are the lessons that they're going to learn how to be the oppressor in a new place that is economically more sort of on the margins than they are. So, as you're talking about this notion of, the sin of self-centeredness, the sin of selfishness, that sin of narcissism, and the narcissism that we sometimes experience when we talk about our inclusivity as a church. We pat ourselves on the back for being inclusive all the time, as though we no longer have any work to do. So the thing that was really important for me was to sort of understand how, Ghanaians and how people from the US are going and experiencing what happened there. But to find a way to not externalize the problem, right? I mean, we see that a lot, right? People are saying, well, it's those white supremacists over there, or it's those people who voted this way over there. And if we could just fix those people, everything would be okay. So we're not looking at our own sinfulness. So I think that the sin of self-centeredness right now has to do with our own narratives about how well we're doing this stuff. And we really, the person that we can transform is ourselves. Can we open up? And I loved what you said about we're following Jesus, we're not catching up. We're like, and it's really important to remember that. I was like, what's your lag time between you and Jesus? I got a whole lot of lag time. But it makes me feel like, if I don't feel like I have to be perfect and I don't have to catch up, then I can be a follower and just keep trying, right? I'm going to be that person maybe who crosses the line of the marathon at like 2 o'clock in the morning and the next day, but I still have the goal in mind of, right, like I want to follow Jesus.
That's right.
See, I listen to you. You're my boss. I listen to you.
You
Yes,
actually do.
I'm
Oh,
being
wow.
formed by you all the time.
Yes. And I by you.
Oh, very good. I think back on the myths I heard about the Episcopal Church as I was being a seminarian, being formed in the church, and what a whitewashed view of our own history as an Episcopal Church I heard, and how incurious I was. I'd be skeptical about the New Testament, about church history elsewhere, skeptical about everything else, but why did this myth of the Episcopal Church somehow so easily reconciling after the Civil War, when we were the church of the slave owners? Yeah. And how did we, I could say a little bit about this diocese. Bishop Baskerville Burroughs talks about the sundowner laws in Indiana. And one town, when she would make her visitation in Indiana, they put "Welcome, Bishop Jennifer" at the exact same place where the Sundowner sign used to be. But I mean, before we can sort of live into the redemption, we've got to tell the truth. And you've been to the place where that truth was just inescapable. I mean, to call people into being this community of the beloved where we're reconciled, how can we do that work in our communities of truth-telling in a way that draws people into the reconciliation that Jesus called us to?
Heidi?
I was just going to listen to what you say and
No,
write it
no,
down.
I hear you. Yeah.
You know, truth-telling is hard. Truth-telling takes courage. And hearing difficult truths also takes courage. So really, Christianity is not for wimps, as you were saying. It is very hard. It is very serious work to be a Christian. And I really am a Christian. I really believe. I really believe in the resurrection. I really believe in the Holy Meal. I really believe all of those things. And so sometimes the hardest piece is not to tell the truth, but to hear somebody else's very complex truth, especially when the truth resonates with us in an authentic way and it convicts us of our own sin. And sometimes those are little sins and sometimes they're large sins. You know, that's why my favorite question in the baptismal covenant is, will you persevere in resisting evil? And whenever, because you're going to do it all the time, you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord. So all of us being able to hold one another's truths. I know I hear a lot from Episcopalians who voted for our president that they feel that they're no longer welcome in the Episcopal Church. And I think that that is a real heartbreaking kind of tragedy. If Hillary Clinton is a beloved child of God made in God's image, and so is Donald Trump, and you know all the white supremacists who, you know, the Ku Klux Klan right now, they say, they will tell you that they're not racist, that they are a white culture and white power advocacy group. So the label racist has essentially lost meaning, but they also are beloved children of God made in God's image. And what am I going to do? How am I called to be in right relationship with them? And that's some truth telling that I have to deal with, right? What is their truth that I'm not seeing that has made them feel that white supremacy is the way to go? And if my behavior has contributed to that, then I need to repent and return to the Lord.
Yes. Yes.
I think the idea that we've already arrived, I think we'd agree, is not the truth. That's why the pilgrimage model is a great one, right? That the pilgrimage, the journey, is what this work is. I mean, it's ongoing work, and again, you know, working with young people who have been told we've arrived. Yeah, we've done the work, we've done the hard work. You know, congratulations, you're there. Is not true. And in the hallway of the school, when, you know, this child is just unkind to this child because he's a musician and she's an athlete, or whatever the reason is that day, that there's a reason to not see the dignity in the other person. That shows us we haven't arrived yet. And that's why the truth-telling is so important and so hard. But it's a process of holding up the mirror sometimes and saying, so we say we are this. How's it going? Right. You know, holding up sort of the mission statement, or even more difficult, the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. I was also listening. Holding that up next to the mirror and saying, okay, this gospel tells me who I'm supposed to be, and who, you know, and who I'm following, and what I'm supposed to be teaching, and how I'm supposed to be forming others. And here's the mirror that says, well, Lisa, is it happening? Like, how is it today? And that is a hard juxtaposition, but it's a good spiritual discipline to hold up that mirror and say, because we haven't arrived.
I have a question for Bishop Waldo. So you're a diocesan bishop. So, like Lisa and I, we're kind of talking to people that's more interpersonal. You have this sort of symbolic role as a diocesan bishop. And how's your personal pilgrimage story translating into your discipleship and leadership in the Diocese of Upper South Carolina? Easy question.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, actually. And again, I will actually talk about that some in a few minutes, but I will say that it is, I tell the truth as often and as explicitly as I can in as many situations as possible. Mm-hmm. That kind of is the guiding principle about, and I talk about it not just about race, but about guns.
Right.
About abortion, about other, we haven't had the abortion conversation much lately, but we've been having a lot of those other ones lately. Right. And it is something about the Ghana trip said to me as a diocesan that that I cannot anymore simply tiptoe around the things that are in the room. Mm. That I can't just play politics with them, or just sort of gently, I don't know what you call it. Just wiggle out of it, whatever it is. I don't want to offend this person or that person. How do I do this? And I can be really good at that. But there's something about this. I already had a streak of it in me, but this just sort of emboldened me. And maybe it's because I've been there for 8 years now that I also feel that I have relationships with, when I first got there 8 years ago, for 5 years, every single parish forum, we talked about the issues involved in same-sex blessings. We talked theology. We talked about differences within our churches, and I felt at the time that it was my call to be as vulnerable in those conversations as I could possibly be, and so the relationships deepened, and we were barely affected by General Convention's votes. And we have marriages going on in the Diocese of Upper South Carolina. Something that when we started the conversation, I didn't imagine would happen for a generation. And so this one has, and my particular history has really given me a lot of courage to say things. And I've also been encouraging the historians in the diocese. There's one in particular who some of you who are from the lower diocese, I mean the Episcopal Church in South Carolina, they don't like being called the lower diocese, but since the Supreme Court of South Carolina called them that, I said, okay, it's legal now.
Oh, dear.
But at any rate, there's this state historian who's a member of the cathedral in Upper South Carolina, Walter Edgar is his name. And he has collected a lot of really deep and painful history on the Episcopal Church and race in South Carolina. And we are making sure he gets in front of as many people as we can get him in front of to tell that story. He has an NPR program, or a local public radio, a statewide public radio program, and he's done a little of that conversation on public radio as well. So
Fantastic.
We're getting there.
That's wonderful.
Would you mind telling the story of just an example of going into a congregation in your diocese and telling a story? How did it go? How did it feel? What was it like in a particular congregation?
Well, actually, I'm going to say that because I'm going to put this group through that exercise.
Awesome.
More to come.
When we get to the end of the day. So you will see. But
Lots of foreshadowing here. This is
I
really
know,
good.
I know, well,
Get ready.
I was a little worried about the panel because I'm thinking I'm going to have to say stuff about what I'm going to be
Right.
saying later. But yeah, I've taken to. I can say this, that I've noticed today happens to be the 29th anniversary of my ordination to the priesthood. And,
Congratulations.
And in all those years of being in parishes, I've served parishes in Manchester, New Hampshire, LaGrange, Georgia, Excelsior, Minnesota, before I came here. So I've been in really varied places. And the thing I noticed more than anything else about pedagogy in the Episcopal Church was that most rectors, not all, and there's not all congregations, but the most common form of adult formation and this was true for me some, offered by clergy is a study about their favorite book of the day. There's some book they've been reading and they want to do a forum on that. I was a professional musician in Boston, early music. I have a master's degree in the recorder. Early music. That's how I got to know. That's how
He's
I got to know
he's actually a very famous early music recorder.
He really is.
Recorder.
I mean,
Yeah. It's like,
I don't know about that. What I do know is, and I have 3 sons who are musicians. My wife is a musician, and we didn't ask our kids if they wanted to play. It was, which instrument do you want to play? It was, how many days a week do you have to practice, Daddy? How many days a week do you eat?
right.
And so the question of pedagogy for me is partly a question of how do we. It was what you were saying in your homily this morning about the practice room, and about the studio, and about the training thing. That there is something about our pedagogy that has to be different so that we learn what it means to be a disciple.
Yep.
So disciple doesn't mean follower per se. It means learner. And it happens to be attached to situations where a learner is following a master.
Right.
But a disciple is a learner, and I think we have a ton of work to do on our pedagogical approach. And we're going to do an exercise in that later. So, there you go. Look forward to it.
What I find encouraging about this gathering and inspiring about the places from which we all come is that we are having this conversation at all. When you ask Bishop Waldo about how did it go, and we're all on pins and needles now to learn how it went.
I know.
I have had the frustration since Ghana, to be honest, of coming home and not having anyone to tell, because I keep running into people who don't want to listen. Mm-hmm. And this is good to be here and to get all fired up about it again, as I was on that bus and with those people. There's a lot of fear about this conversation, but I think it has to happen. And the truth is not really appealing to folks, but we don't have to stay in it. But we have to get into it, right? That's repentance. We have to get into the muck in order to turn around in it. And so I'm encouraged by all of you, by this group of folks, and all the places we touch, that we will have the conversation. It's so important.
So I'm going to ask Bishop Curry, because, in the Episcopal Church, we don't necessarily do lament very well, because it's kind of like, well, is that right one or right two? But
Penitential order.
but to think about the role of lament in all of this, right? Because those truths are very hard, and it's sometimes they're so hard that we get so bogged down in the weight of those heavy historical truths that we're talking about, and we lose sight of how to move forward. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the role of lament, and how do we move forward as we confront and embrace and love those really difficult truths.
I don't know for sure if ancient folk were better at it than we are. I'm not sure about that. That there's something in human nature that avoids. That's, I mean, you can even see that in, I mean, Jeremiah wasn't thrilled about lamenting. It wasn't, I mean.
Let's go lament.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. Yeah. It's, but there was among ancient and traditional folk, there are rituals that help people learn how to do it, which probably suggests that people don't do it by nature. They need the ritual to help them.
They need to shut down 8,000 places.
That's exactly it. You just hit it. That's exactly it. Something dramatic has to change the time and the context. When I was in with Jerusalem and Israel, Palestine a couple of weeks ago, the mother of the sheikh of the Druze had died, and Archbishop Suhail asked if I wanted to go with him to pay our condolences to the sheikh, and it was just extraordinary to be in the sheikh community, which is a world, that was a part of the world I had not been in. That was just a whole nother, anyway, what was really fascinating was they had been lamenting, grieving her death for a while. There was a whole ritual. I mean, it was a social world that created space, that stopped time. People stopped working. They stopped what they were doing. Women put on black, covered themselves up. The men were in black. Basically, the ritual helped people do what people probably would avoid by nature. And I fear that we have so truncated, even death. I think we've avoided the power of lament as giving us, I don't mean emotional in the trivial sense, space to live on the level of the deep emotions that can drive us, that are deeper than our thoughts, just thinking, so that we can actually work through it on a deeper spiritual level. We don't have that as easily. I mean, I'm just saying we don't have that as easily, because basically, I mean, I was a parish priest. I mean, Pennsylvanians like to get the funeral over in an hour. And don't like to have a lot of hollers. I remember when I was a little boy, as a side note, when I was a kid, I come from a family where there are a few Episcopalians, and then there are a bigger group of Pentecostals, and then a big group of Baptists. And the family joke was like, how long the funeral was going to be, and when were we going to get back so we could eat the dinner after the funeral. And everybody knew, like, if it was Baptist, it was somebody Baptist side of the family had died, you fasting for a little while. You're not going to eat. But if it was the Pentecostal holiness side of the family, just forget the day. You'll eat eventually. But they knew if it's the Episcopalian family, dinner will be served in an hour. I mean, but I realized there was some wisdom in that longer grief. That was a residual of a day when people were able to actually close down the stores in Starbucks to grieve, which can become true lament, which, if you look at the Lamentations of in the Old Testament, that is the prelude to the end of exile. But you don't get free until you have deeply lamented. And so I'm not sure, I'm not answering it completely, except intuitively I know that we need rituals, communal rituals and ways of helping us to grieve deeply and therefore to lament. You got to name it. And then the possibility of freedom and healing happens.
Amen.
If I could name one thing more, in our church, who we are means that the vast majority of Episcopalians never have to be with people lamenting the injustices of racism. The communities that feel that every day, and to be allowed into that, where that story is shared, so that you can then reach out and feel that lament. One of the hardest things is we're so divided that we don't get the chance because we're separated and sort of bask in privileged communities, to stand alongside those who are feeling the full force of these evil forces. And we need, how do we lead people into that, into the depth and the richness of that lamenting? I completely agree with you. It is, it's tough, but there's something there that feeds the soul at the same time.
I think part of it is, and this may be where pilgrimage is, and ways of actually engaging deeply in the stories of others and in our own stories. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, I'm 65 now, so as a kid, before the late 60s, and when there was an identity shift among blacks in America to black, we've gone through a series, colored, Negro, Afro-American, African-American, black, and peoples of color. I mean, we have so many names, it's just, anyway, that's a whole nother issue. But I remember before black became beautiful, about 1968. I mean, that's when the songs and everything came, and that was a real issue in the black community. That was a real issue because the connotation about blackness was it was connoted with evil. It was connoted with bad. I mean, think of all the things that are, all that. So there was a real struggle. What you had was an identity struggle. Before that, and I remember when it actually changed, among blacks, there was rarely talk about slavery. It was a conversation, you were aware of it, but there was not a lot of conversation about it. There was almost a sense of shame. Almost. Now, what happened was ABC put Alex Haley's book, Roots, on TV. And then all of a sudden, black folk got mad, which was the prelude to lament. The story got told. And all of a sudden, that led at first to anger. But then it led to a kind of, this is where, let me go back and find out about these folk. And that was the prelude. I'm not saying all the healing has happened, but it was the prelude to being able to actually lament the slavery, to grieve, you see what I mean? To grieve what should be grieved, and then to be able to embrace the past in a new way that actually helps to define who you are in the present. But somebody had to tell the story. And until the story was, and they had to tell it out loud. And until the story gets told, whatever that story is, which is a way of talking about telling the truth. But sometimes story is a way you can get to truth without being bludgeoned. You know what I mean?
Right.
And when that happens, and there's a hearing and a responding, then maybe the truth can be received. And the truth and the pain of it can be grieved. And then life can be lived. And part of the struggle in our culture, James Baldwin said it well, a book of his essays was called Nobody Knows My Name. We don't know each other's names deeply, which is a way of saying we don't actually know each other. And until our stories, your story, yours, and mine, until those stories are shared and heard and received, we as a nation and as a culture will not find our true healing. But when they are, old things get made new.
Say the name.
Say the name. Yes, sir.
I'd like to add an invitation to that. I think sometimes we can get paralyzed by the hardship of other people's stories. And I think for people who live in the United States, it's very hard to go to Ghana. I could see in some folks that when we were in the very far north, where everyone is a black African, that they were struggling with their level of discomfort of being the other, right? And that was a real struggle. And so I think we talk, you all have heard the term white privilege, right? And sometimes that's used as a bludgeon, and I'm not meaning to use that as a bludgeon. But one of the ways that I think white privilege shows up in our church is that, when people of color, disabled people, physically challenged folks, whatever that might be, folks who maybe are underrepresented in the church, tell their story of hardship, that folks in the dominant culture is like, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. And we perform our outrage, which sort of puts that back on us who shared our stories, like, you are now responsible for disrupting my comfort and my day. And when you come to us and say, I'm just so sorry, but I'm so glad that my parents raised me to be a good person, and it's kind of like you're keeping us in that same place of grief, like we don't ever get to move forward because we're the sort of focal point for your feeling some grief. And I do this too. I struggle with my own isms and how I deal with certain kinds of populations. I have so much freaking educational privilege, it's not even funny. And I forget that sometimes, and it shows up, right? So the point of it is not for me to go out and say, oh, well, I'm doing all this repair work, thank you for fixing me, because then that again makes it that person's burden. It doesn't allow them to go forward. So the invitation is, when we feel this outrage, when we feel this grief, that's more important than ever to figure out what does it mean to be in right relationship, right, with people who are very different from ourselves, whose experiences are so different that they seem almost unknowable. But I think that that's what we are being called to do. I think that that is a vocational call for all of us, right, to fully see the person standing right in front of us as the hands and feet of Jesus, even if in that moment it feels like that person is trying to destroy you, which happens a lot in church, actually. But, to be able to sort of live into that grief and not, again, make it the oppressed person's problem to, like, comfort you through your grief, but to figure out a way to have that as like the mustard seed in your own sort of spiritual formation and transformation, as to say, wow, I need to kind of understand my own reaction and live with it and pray about it, and see whether, am I engaged in this so that I can call myself like a good person, pat myself on the back, or am I called to be a healer and reconciler and a justice maker? Because that is, when you commit to being a healer and a reconciler and a justice maker, you're in it for life. It is a lifetime membership. And if you're not really clear about why you want to do that, then you will give up the first time that it gets hard. And in this work, it's never not hard. But that's the beauty, the seeking our own redemption. Like I said, I really believe all that stuff. and there's joy in it. There is tremendous joy in it, in being transformed by those kinds of experiences. So I just would invite all of us to think about those painful places as those mustard seeds of our own transformation.
Thank you, Heidi. This is such a fun conversation. I'd love to hog it with much more questions from me, but I know that there are many questions out among our gathering, and who would like to ask a question? Time for 2 questions.
Hi, I'm Hannah from San Diego, and right now our assisting bishop in our interim is past presiding bishop Catherine Jeffords Shorey. And one thing she's brought to us is an awareness about the native peoples whose lands we are on. And there's an interesting moment in staff meeting when we were planning convention, and she asked us, if we could at the beginning of convention just say, we'd like to honor the people whose land we're occupying. And none of us knew the names of the tribes of the people there. And so that's just another thing I think to be aware of. And I'm wondering if we know the people's names whose this land was, and if we could honor them at some point in this conference.
I do see Canon Spellers tapping at her watch to the presiding bishop. So just one quick question. One more.
So I just have a question that's random but important. What do you all listen to for music that generates some of the energy that you need to do the work?
Can you ask it again?
What do you listen to?
Oh.
Music that helps generate some of that energy to do the work.
You're asking,
I have.
you're asking him that question?
Yes.
I'm asking all of you. I'm asking all of you, please.
Oh, I did calculate that if I played everything on my iPhone constantly, it would take 5 weeks. But I listen to Baroque and Renaissance music, I listen to bluegrass music, I listen to country music, I listen to Allman Brothers. I don't know. It all energizes me.
I would say the Bach B minor Mass and Parliament Funkadelic.
You know, I love the question because different traditions of music making have different emotional ranges of expression. And you're going to get to hear, you heard Yuri singing earlier, and Yuri and Michael's music in slightly different vein than what we heard at the beginning. Worshiping in a different cultural idiom than the one in which you were raised stretches your ability to pray emotionally in new directions. And so you're going to find out here, I'm at the behind the table, and I look down and my hips are doing this. And that's never happened to me before. And so I'm lucky to have that kind of music right here. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Yeah, mine varies. I mean, my playlist, or whatever you call it, on my iPad, it will go from, I can go from Yo-Yo Ma to John Coltrane to the new Jesus Christ Superstar with John
Legend.
Oh my God,
yeah.
it's awesome. It's
Because John Legend. Sorry.
I didn't notice that, but okay.
Fangirl. A little fangirl thing going on here.
Okay. Well, there you have it.
Thank you.
I've listened to the 5th grade musical at EDS's next week, and so I've been listening to so much Lion King that's not the answer for me right now. But when I need to remember my own roots, it's Canadian folk music and so on. But I also am, maybe I should learn more rap for the same reason that I love hymnody. And that, there are days and nights when the most important thing for me to hear is that soul, though all hell shall endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never forsake. And so I think going back to hymnody, which is the answer you would expect me to have, I guess, but it is the answer I've got.
Let's show our appreciation to our
Thank you.